Next on the agenda is a preview of executive budget proposal. Dr. Swift.
Thank you, President Johnson and trustees and members of the community. As you are aware, the governor shared her version of the 21-22 budget just a few days ago. And we are now, every day is budget day in the Ann Arbor Public Schools, and yet we are now on this path to get the different versions of the budget, proposed budget, from the executive branch, from the House, and from the Senate. And so this will be the first of a number of not lengthy presentations, but brief overviews of those versions of the budget. It is February 17th. And as you all know, trustees, you're required by law to pass a balanced budget by June 30th. With the information you have at hand. So this is really the first component of information, and Ms. Minnick is joining us this evening to share the first version of the budget, the executive version.
Thank you, Dr. Swift. Good evening, trustees. Yes, as Dr. Swift mentioned, this is the very first preliminary step to the budget process for the state of Michigan for the 2021-2022 fiscal year, and therefore our 21-22 school year. The State Budget Office, along with the governor, presented their executive budget on February 11th, last Thursday. And as part of that, we will discuss some highlights. And the first tonight is foundation allowance. This is the primary funding source for public schools in Michigan. In very simplistic terms, the dollar value of the foundation allowance is multiplied by the student count to arrive at a basic level of funding. The executive budget proposes an increase for next year of $164 per pupil for districts that are currently funded at the minimum foundation level. And $82 per pupil for districts at or above the foundation, the target foundation level, like Ann Arbor Public Schools. This is what is known as the 2X formula. The minimum funded districts receive 2 times the increase as a means for narrowing the funding gap among districts. Using the October 2020 pupil count then, the estimated increase to Ann Arbor Public Schools would be about $1.4 million. As I mentioned, schools are primarily funded by multiplying the foundation allowance by the student count. So very simplistically, traditionally student counts are taken twice each year and then mathematically blended to arrive at a number on which funding will be based. But in response to the pandemic and the decline in school enrollment across the state, the student count on which we are receiving funding for this school year only is a weighted combination of the prior year's blended count and this year's blended count. And the reason I mention this is because it's called the super blend, and its intent is to lessen the financial impact of decreased enrollments. But this year, for 21-22, the executive budget proposes a different approach to lessening the impact of declining enrollment. It recommends returning to the traditional blend of student count for next year, a blend of the current year's October count and the prior year's February count. So instead of the super blend to lessen the impact of declining enrollment, this mechanism will fund about 70% of the student count loss and only at a lesser foundation amount. So we won't know the funding implications for Ann Arbor Public Schools until we have that February count finalized and a projection of the October enrollment. Weighted funding model. The weighted funding model was presented by the School of Finance Research Collaborative back in January of 2018. You may be familiar with that. And this executive budget proposal does include a weighted funding model for a portion of the budget. That model funds beyond a per pupil foundation allowance for students with more costly educational needs. So for instance, The reimbursement categorical for special education has been recommended to be maintained, not increased, but maintained. And that rate, that categorical rate, is an additional 2.2% above the traditional reimbursement rate of 28.6%. Another type of weighted funding is to improve funding for at-risk education for at-risk students. And so in this executive proposal, it is recommended to increase at-risk funding for Ann Arbor Public Schools from 30% to 35% of the calculated amount. And I say calculated amount because the total amount for at-risk is currently prorated. So the estimated impact for Ann Arbor Public Schools is potentially an increase of about $160,000 for at-risk. I should note that at-risk funding is a categorical, but it functions as a grant. So those funds may only be used to provide restricted purposes, those things restricted to serving our at-risk population and not for increases in salaries and benefits across the board. Other proposed funding, there has been some proposals for a supplemental fiscal year 21 package. Some of those things include an increase in our Great Start Readiness program for our 4-year-old children in school readiness preschool programs, and also Filter First initiative for grants to replace school drinking fountains with fixtures that are capable of filtering impurities. Other statewide proposed funds include student recovery services. $250 million has been allocated in this proposed budget, along with $60 million for summer 2021 learning and out-of-school time engagement. Out-of-school time meaning evenings, weekends, non-school days. But again, these funds would come to our district on a reimbursable basis, so the bottom line is not affected. So the executive budget recommendation, what does all this mean to us? Well, the executive budget recommendation acknowledges those increases in the projected state revenues that we saw as a result of the January Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference with a foundation allowance increase. It lessens the impact of declining enrollment. It addresses weighted funding for special student populations and acknowledges that recovery funding may be needed. As Dr. Swift alluded to, this is, again, a very first preliminary step in the budget process for the state and for our district. The House and Senate will be presenting their own versions of their budget proposals over the coming months, typically between March and May. And the state will hold its second Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference in May as well. At that point, then, the House and the Senate will achieve funding consensus. They will agree on an education budget, typically in June or by June. And then statutorily, we are required as a school district for the board to approve the next year's school budget by June 30th. So as Dr. Swift mentioned, it's a very preliminary first step, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ms. Minnick.